Chapter 25. I don't have a good feeling about this, Ambler said. The two men were walking down Boulevard de Bonne Nouvelle, the auditor holding both his hands together under his overcoat for warmth. Ambler would never do that, no operative would. But then Caston's hands were good for very little outside of an office. Caston's eyes were downcast, monitoring the sidewalk in front of him for dog feces. Ambler's gaze casually swept the street, alert to any signs of surveillance. You what? The auditor gave him a withering look. You heard me. Did your horoscope say your stars were in a bad alignment? Did an entrail reading priest find something nasty in the offal? I mean, look, if you know something I should know, let's talk about it. If you've got a rationally justified belief, more power to you. But how many times do we have to go through this? We're grown-ups. We should be responsive to facts, not feelings. A reality check. You don't have the home field advantage here. We're not in spreadsheet land. Those are real glass and stone buildings around you, not columns of digits. And if somebody takes a shot at one of us, it'll be with a real bullet, not a goddamn bell curve of possible bullets. Anyway, how would somebody like you even know about an agency safe house? On the principle of need to know, it should be off your radar screen, because it sure isn't info a pencil neck like you needs to have. You still don't get it. Who pays the rent? Who sees the bills? Nothing that costs the agency money is off my radar screen. I'm an auditor. Nothing auditable is alien to me. Ambler was silent for a moment. How do you know the place isn't going to be occupied? Because the lease comes up at the end of this month and we're letting it expire. And because we've got a budget item for the cleanup crew that's slated to arrive next week. Ergo, it's empty, but it's still equipped. I reviewed requisition items related to Paris before I left, so I can tell you that the average monthly cost of the Rue Bouchardon residence for the past 48 months was, in adjusted dollars, $2,830. Additional variable charges include, in descending order of magnitude, telecom expenses, which in turn range from... Okay, stop, you've made your point. The building on Rue Bouchardon looked oddly desolate, the stone facade dappled with lichen and soot. The windows grimy, and at the doorway, the black metal grille battered and chipped. A nearby Mercury street lamp sparked and buzzed. How do we get in? Ambler asked Caston. Not my department. Caston looked affronted. What, you expect me to do everything? You're the goddamn operative. So operate. Shit. This wasn't like the parking garage at the Clinique de Louvre. The site was exposed, which meant he'd have to try something that worked fast. Ambler knelt down and untied one of his shoes. When he stood up again, he was holding a thin key, flat, but for 5 small elevations between the cuts. It was called a bump key, and getting it to work required both skill and luck. He doubted he had enough of either. Stay here, he told Caston. Ambler loped over to a dumpster at the end of the short street and returned a few minutes later with a soiled paperback novel someone had thrown out. Still, it was thick and the spine was hard. It would work as well as a mallet. A bump key was designed to hit the bottom pin in the keyway column hard enough that the top pin bounced clear of it for an instant, high enough to go past the shear line. In that same instant, before the spring pushed the top pin down again, the key would turn. In theory. The reality seldom measured up. If the pin columns did not bounce high enough, it would not work. If the button pin bounced too high, it would not work. If the key was twisted an instant too late, it would not work. Now he positioned the bump key right in front of the hole and banged it with the spine of the paperback, shooting it through the keyway as hard as he could and then twisting it the instant it was in. Ambler could not believe it. It worked. The first time. That almost never happened. The key turned, retracted the latch, and he pushed the door open. He felt a surge of pride at his handiwork and, smiling, turned to Caston. The auditor was stifling a yawn. Finally, Caston groused, "I can't believe it took you so long." With great effort, Ambler remained silent. Once they were inside the building, Ambler would be able to work on the apartment door without fear of being observed. The building seemed entirely vacant, but the CIA team that had equipped the apartment had also taken care to give it a proper Mortise lock. Ambler scrutinized the strike plate for a few minutes before giving up. With a proper tension wrench, she might have been able to make progress, but he lacked the tools for the job. Caston was openly scornful. "Can't you do anything right? You're supposed to be the hotshot operative. 20 years at the PSU, and now..." Ambler cut him off. "Caston, put a sock in it." Finally, Ambler walked to the building's cramped courtyard. The ground floor apartment had a couple of windows that faced the desolate courtyard. It would be an inelegant mode of entry, but it would do. Hammering again with the spine of the paperback book, Ambler smashed a rectangular pane of glass and methodically removed all the remaining shards. He stood stock still for a moment, listening, but there was nothing to be heard, no sign of any habitation, no sign that anyone had heard the broken glass. "You just cost the United States of America $400, Caston said softly. "At least. Never mind the replacement costs. The labor costs for a glazier in Paris are astronomical." Ambler placed both hands on the stone ledge and, with a sudden jerk, pulled himself up and then over through the glassless window. A sturdy-looking bookcase projected beneath it, and he was able to somersault over it gently and land on his feet. Walking carefully in the gloom, he made his way to the door, turned on some lights, and then retracted the deadbolt. At last, he opened the front door, where Caston, arms folded on his chest, was standing, slouching impatiently. "Plus, it's freezing outdoors," Caston said, "and you had to break a goddamn window. Just get in." He closed the door behind Caston and reflexively locked it again. A safe house would not have an alarm system. The possible arrival of the police represented a greater threat than any random burglary. The two men wandered through the apartment until they found a small room with a large television in it. Beneath it was what looked on a casual glance like a regular cable box. Ambler knew better. The roof of the building would have satellite equipment connected to the ground floor with a non-interceptable fiber optic cable. The box contained complex decryption equipment. It was not a high-security device and was not designed for the reception of sensitive information. But then the material they would be accessing was technically unclassified, if not widely available. Caston pulled at drawers in the monitor stand until he found a keyboard. He smiled at it, as if he had come across a friend. Now he turned on the monitor and busied himself with the keyboard for a few minutes. The screen blinked to life, but it only displayed snow. "Let's see if I can remember how this is done," Caston said, mainly to himself, as he fidgeted with the remote. Abruptly, the screen filled with digits displaying size and times for a series of large file downloads. Caston no longer looked peevish, now he looked grave. "I'm taking these from open source sector," he explained to the operative. "Non-classified, public domain materials for the most part. I just want you to see Ashton Palmer in his element. You're the face expert, okay? I want you to see that face full-sized in color and at maximum resolution." He fussed with the keyboard for another minute, adjusting various settings. Suddenly, the screen was vibrant and animated with the image of Palmer speaking at a lectern. "This is from the mid-90s, Caston went on. A speech he gave at a conference sponsored by the Center for Policy Studies. There was a reference to it in one of the journal articles that your friend found in the BNF. Palmer's polite, but I doubt you'll have to listen very hard to figure out what he's really saying." On the screen, Ashton Palmer looked confident, magisterial, almost serene. Dark curtains were visible behind him. He looked elegant in a navy suit, dark red tie, and pale blue shirt. The traditional form of Chinese housing in cities was the Yuan, literally four-side enclosed courtyards. They were composed of inward-facing dwellings on all sides, a tableau of complete enclosure. In other civilizations, the metropolitan centers were centers, too, of the cosmopolitan urge, the urge to look outward, whether in conquest or discovery. This has never been the Chinese way. Rather, the very architecture of the Yuan has proved an apt symbol in the national character. Ashton Palmer looked up from the lectern, his slate-gray eyes glittering. The Middle Kingdom was, for a millennium, and for dynasty after dynasty, a profoundly inward-looking realm. A pervasive xenophobia was perhaps the deepest and most constant element of that multifarious array of customs and habits of thought we call Chinese culture. Chinese history contains no Peter the Great, no Empress Catherine, no Napoleon, no Queen Victoria, no Kaiser Wilhelm, no Tojo. Since the collapse of the Tatar yoke, there has been nothing we can call a Chinese empire. There has only been China. Vast, yes. Powerful, without question. But ultimately a four-sided enclosure. Ultimately an enormous Yuan. One may debate whether this ingrained xenophobia served the Chinese people well. What should be beyond debate is that it has served the rest of us well. Ambler moved nearer to the 56-inch high-density screen, riveted by the image of the eloquent scholar, the burning intelligence he seemed to radiate. Some political scholars believe that China would change once the communists seized control, Palmer said, after taking a sip of water from a glass at the lectern. Surely international communism was just that, international in its orientation. Surely its expansionist horizons would turn China outward, open it at least to its Eastern Bloc brethren. So students of politics supposed. Of course, that is not what happened. Chairman Mao maintained the tightest control over his countrymen of any leader in history. He made himself into a godhead. And for all the bellicosity of his rhetoric, he not only insulated his countrymen from the strong winds of modernity, but he was deeply conservative, indeed reactive in his projection of military force. A few very minor skirmishes aside, there are only two instances of note. One was the conflict in the Korean Peninsula in the early 50s, where, nota bene, the Chinese actually believed that the United States was planning to launch an invasion. The Korean standoff resulted from a defensive, not an offensive posture. The fact is that Chairman Mao was truly the last emperor, one whose obsessions were inward, having to do with the purity of his followers. Palmer's expression remained dispassionate as he elaborated his vision, but his words were spoken with mesmerizing fluency. It is only in recent years that we have begun to see a seismic shift within China, a genuine turning outward fueled by its incredibly swift insertion into the system of global capitalism. It was the very development that one American administration after another fervently hoped for and sought to promote. But, as the Chinese would say, one should be careful what one wishes for. We have awoken the tiger, hoping to ride it. He paused, and his mouth formed a thin smile. And, dreaming as we have of riding the tiger, we have forgotten what happens when you fall off it. The political strategists convinced themselves that economic convergence would lead to political convergence, a harmonization of interests. Something like the opposite is true. Two men in love with the same woman, a recipe for peaceable coexistence? I think not. A sound of scattered laughter from the audience could be heard. Likewise, when two entities share the same competitive goal, Whether economic domination in some realm or political dominion over the Pacific region seems to have escaped the attention of our myopic political masterminds that as China has become increasingly market-driven, she has become increasingly warlike as well. A decade after Mao's death, China sank 3 Vietnamese ships in the area of the Spratly Islands. By 1994, you see the clash between American ships and a Chinese submarine in the Yellow Sea, and in subsequent years, the seizure of Mischief Reef from the Philippines, the missiles fired by the coast of Taiwan in an international waterway, and so on. The Chinese Navy has acquired an aircraft carrier from the French and a series of surveillance radar systems from the British, while China has constructed a passage from the Yunnan province to the Bay of Bengal, thus securing access to the Indian Ocean. The actions we have seen so far can be easily dismissed, for they are deceptively small in scale. In fact, these are probes, nothing less, attempts to assess the resolve of the international community. Time and again they have learned of the toothlessness of their competitors, their rivals. And make no mistake, we are, for the first time in history, rivals. Palmer's gaze grew eerily intent as he pressed his point. China is on fire, and it is the West that has provided the fuel. By its moves toward economic liberalization, China has gained hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign capital. We're seeing a GDP growth rate upward of 10% a quarter, faster than any nation has grown without massive upheaval. We're seeing gigantic increases in consumption as well. The awakening tiger will, within a few years, be consuming 10% of the world's petroleum production, a third of its steel production. Simply as a consumer, it has a disproportionate influence over the nations of Southeast Asia, as well as Korea, Japan, and indeed Taiwan. Our conglomerates increasingly depend upon the Chinese dynamo for their own growth. Does any of this sound familiar, ladies and gentlemen? Again, Palmer fell silent, his eyes scanning the unseen audience before him. His sense of cadence was masterly. Let me break it down for you. Consider a country that has experienced what could be called a second industrial revolution. A country where labor was cheap, capital and resources abundant. A country that was able to transform its economy into the most efficient and swiftest growing in the world. I refer, he raised his voice subtly, to the United States of America as it appeared in the early years of the 20th century. We all know what ensued. A period of unquestioned military, industrial, economic, and cultural supremacy. A period of power and prosperity we designate in shorthand as the American century. He glanced down at the lectern before resuming. The American century was a redoubtable thing, but nobody ever promised it would be permanent. Indeed, there is every reason to believe that it will not be. Every reason to believe that the 21st century will, in retrospect, be identified as the Chinese century. Murmurs from the audience were audible. Whether this is a condition to be celebrated or bemoaned, it is not my place as an impartial scholar to say. I will only note the irony that this development will have been the fruits of our own labor. Well-meaning Americans, dominant within our foreign policy establishment, have ceaselessly worked to awaken the tiger, to turn an inward-facing kingdom outward. Our children will live with the results. In a soft voice he added, or die from them. Ambler shuddered. He tried to remember other times when he had seen faces that exuded such self-certainty and zeal. The visages that presented themselves were not reassuring. Dr. Abimael Guzman, the murderous founder of Peru's Shining Path Terrorists, was one. David Koresh, the self-styled messiah of the Branch Davidians, was another. Yet Ashton Palmer had a quality of urbanity, of spurious civility, that distinguished him from such obvious fanatics and made him potentially even more dangerous. Again and again, our SOI-DISANT quote-unquote China hands misread the green tea leaves. Everyone here will recall the widespread unrest in China when her embassy in Belgrade was bombed in the course of an American airstrike. Millions of Chinese citizens refused to believe that it could have been an accident. Hand-wringing could be seen throughout Washington. The resurgence of anti-Americanism was widely taken to be a bad thing. These experts have not learned the wisdom of what the Chinese sage Chung Wen-han called simply shuangxing, or doubleness. In fact, the efflorescence of xenophobia might actually have been good for America. Anything that slows China's integration into the community of nations we know will also serve as a drag on the engines of her growth. A skeptic might hold that any such development was a good thing for America and a good thing for the world. Since I am an impartial and dispassionate scholar, of course, it is not my place to root for one outcome or another. But if, as I believe, we have reached a fork in the road, perhaps I can help direct our attention at what lies at the end of each path. Conflict with China is inevitable. What is not inevitable is whether we lose. That will depend on our choices, on choices we make today. Clay Caston knelt down and typed a series of commands on the keyboard again until another video clip began to play. This feed was fuzzier, apparently copied from a C-SPAN broadcast from just a couple of years ago. Here you'll hear him singing a different tune, Caston said. Of course, the Center for Strategic Studies conference was a closed event. It was Palmer speaking mainly to acolytes. The C-SPAN broadcast was of a panel assembled in Washington by another think tank, representing a diversity of opinions. He may have decided to assume a different face. Among a panel of 5 sinologists, Ashton Palmer stood out. His expression was of icy imperturbability. His high forehead and clear gray gaze exuded intelligence and thoughtfulness. The clip began with a question asked by a young, gangly man in the audience with a thick beard and thicker glasses. Do you feel, Professor Palmer, that America's policy toward China is insufficiently skeptical, insufficiently attuned to our own national interests? Because many people in the State Department today would look at the rise of President Liu Eng and call that a great success and a tribute to their policy of constructive engagement. Palmer smiled as the camera returned to him. And that's fair enough, he said. Liu Eng is a marvelously appealing politician. I have only the greatest hopes that he represents the future. Palmer smiled again, showing white, even teeth. Despite the smooth avowal and easy manner, Ambler felt a chill. As he studied Palmer's face, he detected, no, he simply saw, a profound and seething contempt and hostility toward the statesman of whom he spoke. At the very moment he uttered Liu Eng's name, a fleeting expression passed over Palmer's face that utterly belied his words. So I can only say that I truly hope the State Department triumphalists are correct, Palmer concluded. Anyway, we have to work with him. Caston grunted. The guy sounds totally plausible here, too. He's a hard cat to figure. Now it was Ambler's turn to work the keyboard. The video software had an icon that enabled one to move the video display forward or back, and he reversed the clip until it reached the moment when Ashton Palmer said the name of the Chinese president. Now Ambler advanced the video frame by frame. There. In a micro-pause between the two parts of the Chinese name, Palmer's face settled into a radically different expression. The eyes were drawn, the corners of his mouth pulled down, the nostrils flared. It was a face expressive of both outrage and disgust. By another frame or two it had vanished, replaced by an artificial look of smiling approval. Jesus Christ, Caston said. Ambler said nothing. Caston shook his head. I would never have picked up on that. There are a lot of things on heaven and earth that don't show up on your almighty spreadsheets, Ambler said. Don't underestimate me, Caston said. I get there in the end. Just in time to pick up the shells after the shootout is over, I'm sure. I've known a few analysts and number crunchers. You work with paper, computers, pore over printouts, charts, graphs, scatter plots, but you don't deal with people. You're more comfortable with bits and bytes. Ow! Caston tilted his head. John Henry did beat the steam drill once. Maybe you were sleeping in when the information age dawned. Today, technology spans borders. It watches, it hears, it registers patterns, small statistical perturbations, and if we're willing to pay attention, it can hear, but it can't listen. It can watch, but it can't observe. And it sure as hell can't converse with the men and women we've got to deal with. There's no substitute for that, goddammit. I find the money trail tends to be a lot more valuable and revealing than most people are. You would, Ambler snapped. He stood up and started to pace. The room felt enclosed, stifling. Okay, you want to talk about logic and probabilistic inference? What's happening in China these days? What does it all mean for a guy like Ashton Palmer? Why does he hate Lu Wang so much? I'm a numbers man, Ambler. I don't do geopolitics, he shrugged. But I read the papers, and we've both heard Palmer's rap at that strategic studies meeting. Since you ask, the main thing about Lu Wang seems to be that he's enormously popular among his own people and an incredible force of liberalization. He's opened markets, established fair trading systems, even cracked down on media piracy, knockoff manufacturing, and the like. But it's gradualism, right? That's the Chinese way. Gradualism, yes, but on an accelerated schedule. That's a contradiction in terms. Lu Wang is a paradoxical figure in a lot of ways. What was that word Palmer referred to? Doubleness. Follow the logic of Palmer's argument, all that stuff about the Chinese century, about what could happen if an inward-looking kingdom starts to become gregarious, starts to become integrated in the community of nations. If you're Palmer, Lu Wang is your worst nightmare. If you're Palmer, Ambler interjected, you'd want to do something about it. I read somewhere that Lu Wang's making some big state visit to America next month, Caston said. He fell silent for a long moment. I'm going to have to make some calls. Ambler's gaze returned to the frozen image of the scholar, trying to extract everything he could from his visage. Who are you? What do you want? He lowered his head, lost in thought. Then the image vanished. Ambler saw the monitor explode, blossoming into a cloud of glass fragments even before he heard the popping sound that accompanied it. Time slowed. What had happened? A bullet, large caliber, rifle, silenced. He whirled around and saw a black-clad gunman crouched commando-style at the end of the hallway outside the room. The man was holding a military assault rifle, a model Ambler recognized, the Heckler & Koch G36. A curved magazine mounted in front of the trigger guard held 30 rounds of 5.56 by 45 millimeter NATO rounds. The optical sights used a red dot reticle. Its casing was a high-strength, lightweight black polymer, highly portable, highly lethal. Standard issue for the Consular Operations Armory.